On behalf of Open Mic, I'd like to thank you for joining us for this webinar on AI's impact on mis and disinformation and how investors can address the threat. I'm Audrey Mokley, Open Mic's executive director, and for those who may not know us, we are a nonprofit organization based in the US and now in Canada that works with investors to ensure the responsible development of digital and emerging technologies. Our conversation today will be moderated by Michael Connor, Open Mic's founding executive director and current senior advisor. The intersection of technology and the information ecosystem is something Michael understands very well. In addition to his longstanding leadership in tech accountability, Michael is a former journalist and media executive, having worked for the Wall Street Journal, ABC News, and Dow Jones. And before we start, I'll mention that this session is being recorded, and it's also under Chatham House rule. We can provide all of you with a recording after we're finished. And we welcome any and all of your questions, so please feel free to put them in the chat below. And with that, I'll hand it over to Michael.
Thank you, Audrey. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Open Mic has been engaged on the issue of misinformation for many years now, and it's clearly not a simple problem to address. What we'd like to do today in this session, I think, is to look at it from three perspectives. First, trying to understand the roots of the problem, or at least some of the roots of the problem. How pervasive is this, and what's causing it? And secondly, what are the harms of misinformation? We'll look at that from one particular perspective. Who's affected by misinformation? And third, what can be done about it? And in particular, what can investors do about it? Can the capital markets play a role in fixing the problem? I can guarantee you that we will not be able to provide definitive answers to those questions, at least not in this hour, but that will be the framework for our discussion. We've got a terrific panel today to help us address those questions. Gordon Crovitz, who I believe is in the center bottom there, from NewsGuard, Michael Khoo on the left of this screen, at least as I see it, and Shuwei Fang from the Shorenstein Center, bringing different perspectives on these issues. I'll be telling you a little bit more about each of the panelists as we go along. If you have questions, and we hope you do, you can submit them in the question box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. We'll leave time for questions toward the end of the session, but I'll also try to interject with questions for the panelists as we go along. And with that, we're going to start our discussion by turning to Gordon Crovitz. Gordon is co-founder and co-CEO of NewsGuard, a company that is a leader in the business of information integrity, providing reporting on the reliability of news sources and claims in the news. NewsGuard has journalist-trained analysts who rate and create nutrition labels. That's what they call it, nutrition labels for news sources, and operate the leading catalog debunking the top significant false claims spreading online. Aside from serving companies and consumers, NewsGuard also helps democratic governments counter malign influence campaigns operated by Russia, China, and Iran. Very timely. Previously, Gordon was publisher of the Wall Street Journal, where he was also an opinion writer. His degrees are from the University of Chicago, Oxford, and Yale Law School. Gordon, welcome to the session, and I'll leave it to you. What's going on with misinformation from your perspective?
Thank you so much. And I appreciate the introduction. And I should say that as the former publisher of the Wall Street Journal, I believe capital markets can solve every social problem. And let us see if we can get this one solved in the next hour. So I have a few slides just to introduce some of the concepts for this webinar. And as you can see here, I have a long title, which is Misinformation, Now Powered by AI, and Still Funded Unintentionally by Blue Chip Advertisers. So let me get into it now. And I realize that we all use some of these words in different ways. So let me explain what we mean by misinformation. Misinformation could be false information, often is. It could be unintentional. Somebody sees a false claim and repeats it. And at least at NewsGuard, we distinguish that kind of misinformation from what we call disinformation, which is intentional, such as the foreign malign influence campaigns run by the governments of Russia, China, and Iran, targeting democracies with intentionally false claims. And you'll see in my presentation, I primarily focus on disinformation, but misinformation is the broader category. So a quick word about NewsGuard. We are a journalistic entity. We provide data for consumers and for companies and different enterprises, and as Michael mentioned, democratic governments in two different ways. We've rated more than 35,000 sources of news based on their journalistic practice. Those are apolitical criteria like does a website disclose its ownership? Does it have a corrections policy? That sort of thing. And that's used by everybody from libraries around the world for helping library patrons when they're using computers at the library, to the advertising industry. I'll talk a bit more about this, where brands now have a very difficult time keeping their ads on appropriate sites and off of disinformation and misinformation sites. And our other database is what we call our false claim fingerprints, where we run, I guess you could think of it as sort of industrial strength fact checking, where for governments and others, we identify significant false claims that are spreading on the internet. And in 80% of those examples, we're the first or the only entity to identify that as a false claim. And we do have a specialty, as Michael said, in Russia, China, and Iran false claims targeting the democracies. So what have we learned about misinformation since 2018 when we were founded? Even before AI, when we looked at all of the news sources that we had rated around, we operated in 10 countries. In the United States, 40% of the news sources that we had rated got a low reliability score from us. We were pretty surprised by that high percent. The US is the world leader in terms of the percent of sites that people use that have a low reliability. New Zealand and Canada, for those of you keeping track, have the lowest percentage of low reliability news sites being accessed. The biggest category here actually are healthcare hoax sites, sites that will sell you a subscription to Peach Pits so that you can cancel your oncology appointment if you have cancer, for example. The malign actors who abuse the open internet come in a lot of different flavors. I mentioned Russia, China, and Iran. Those are really the market leaders, Russia being the best at influence operations. I mentioned healthcare hoaxes. There are a lot of conspiracy sites of different kinds. Our false claims database even includes debunkings of claims like the British royal family are lizard people. That's gotten a lot of play in certain circles. More commonly, I think we're all aware of false claims such as that the measles vaccine causes autism, still gets a tremendous amount of coverage. And now with AI, the pace of false claims, the scale of the false claims, the ease with which false claims can be created and spread is really now qualitatively different, even than it was a couple of years ago. And I'll talk a bit more about that. One of the things that we discovered to our shock is that one of the main motivations behind running an unreliable news outlet is advertising. There are some websites that are in it for the politics or some ideological reason, but many, many, many of them are in it for the money. And I'll talk a bit more about programmatic advertising and how companies can no longer pick and choose where their ads appear. The programmatic advertising ads appear on many, many sites, a lot of them unreliable. And as I say, they are what in the ad industry are now referred to as made for advertising websites. Can't be trusted, but they spread false claims that get a lot of attention, and they monetize that through advertising. And I'll give some examples of how AI is now supercharging the creation and the spread of false claims. So the good news is that uh, companies can solve a large part of the misinformation problem. I don't think companies can counter Russian, Chinese, and Iranian disinformation, but they certainly can defund the thousands and thousands of websites that are created in order to publish crazy claims in the news, generate engagement from viewers, and monetize that engagement through advertising. 80% of advertising these days is what's called programmatic. That means it's digital advertising selected by an algorithm. The average ad campaign these days appears on 40,000 websites. So you can imagine if you're the CEO of a big consumer company or you're the CMO of a bank, you can no longer review those 40,000 websites. It's not as simple as saying, I'd like to advertise here, but not there. Um, one of the effects of that is that, as we found one year, Warren Buffett was the biggest source of subsidy for Vladimir Putin's disinformation targeting the West. Warren Buffett did not wake up in the morning and say, what favor can I do for Vladimir Putin? What happened was that his company, Geico, the insurance company, was the biggest advertiser that year on Sputnik News, one of the Kremlin-funded propaganda sites, disinformation site. And that year, Geico was the biggest advertiser on Sputnik. Warren Buffett had no idea. The CEO of Geico had no idea. The chief marketing officer at Geico had no idea. The ad agency that handled the placement of the ads had no idea. Geico thought its ad agency was protecting it from having its ads appear on sites like that, but the ad agency does protect against ads running on pornography, for example, but they don't protect against ads running on foreign propaganda sites or misinformation sites. There's about $2.5 billion a year in advertising spending that goes to websites that we consider unreliable sites. Sputnik, but thousands of others also. $2.6 billion funds a lot of misinformation. It helps explain why there's so much misinformation on the internet. It is a big business. So one of the services that we provide brands is an inclusion list of thousands and thousands of reliable news sites. A lot of brands just advertise on those as a way to keep their ads off of sites like Sputnik. We also have exclusion lists where we list thousands and thousands of sites that many of them consider a brand unsafe. In conversations that we have with brands, we explain the situation, and all of the conversations are the same. We point to ads running on websites that the CEO of a company and the CMO of a company say that is not our kind of website, running against a claim that our kind of customer would be very dubious about. And the CEO looks at the CMO and says, don't we review all the websites where our ads run? And the CMO looks a little bit embarrassed and says, programmatic advertising, these ads are running on thousands and thousands of websites. We have no way of monitoring them anymore. And the CMO says to the CEO, I'll check with the ad agency. I thought they were protecting us from that. And then the CMO eventually gets back to the CEO and says, gosh, our ad agency is not protecting us. We better try something else. But in the meantime, billions and billions of dollars going to subsidize and encourage the creation and continuation of misinformation websites. So here's a sample. I literally took this at random. This happens to be an ad for Lowe's. It's on a website that gets a 0 out of 100 from NewsGuard. It doesn't meet any of the journalistic criteria. It's against a website story that claims that COVID vaccines kill people to a large degree. And it's everything from COVID to Russian claims about Ukraine, thousands and thousands of false claims. We've actually cataloged now more than 50,000 examples of false claims that have been popular on the internet across every possible news topic. So companies can fix that problem by making sure that their ad agency is not placing ads for them on unreliable sites. If that $2.6 billion in ad revenue went away, that would make a tremendous difference to the spread of false claims. AI supercharges this problem. Malign actors were what I would call early adopters to AI. They were the first to use ChatGPT to create false images, false videos, and audio back with ChatGPT 3.5. Now, of course, malign actors of all kinds are using AI to create false claims across different media, images, videos, audio, text, false documents, all sorts of things. The large language models themselves, much like ad agencies, actually, and like social media platforms, have not yet taken responsibility for this problem. When we audit the LLMs and we audit the 11 largest AI models every month on recent false claims, and we ask, of these recent false claims, how many of them do the AI models spread if somebody prompts them with a question about a claim? And 35% of the time, they'll spread a false claim. We also discovered a campaign by a Russian influence campaign we call the Pravda Network. The Pravda Network identified 200 of the Kremlin's favorite false claims, a lot of them having to do with Ukraine and alleged corruption by the Ukrainian government, all aimed at reducing Western support for Ukraine. They identified 200 false claims. They used AI models to create 6 million articles about those 200 false claims using 250 websites that they created in 50 languages. The result of which was that they succeeded in infecting the AI models. As you all know, the AI models work on what's the next likeliest word based on what content I've had access to as an AI model. And if there's 16 million articles saying that Vladimir Zelensky bought Highgrove Estate from King Charles, and there are no stories about that otherwise because it's completely made up, they will spread that false claim. So if somebody is on TikTok and they see a Russian account that says that Zelensky bought an estate from King Charles, and they wonder if that's really true, and they go onto their favorite AI model, they ask, hey, is this really true? The AI model will say yes, and they will even cite the websites that the Russian influence campaign created. There are also what we would call more misinformation rather than disinformation sites. These are what we call AI slop sites that are just making things up, and they'll have some accurate information, but a lot of inaccurate information. And you can see in the chart to the right the number of AI content farms, as we've described them, growing at a rapid rate. So here's some examples of false claims. In this case, this is sort of a double false claim. These are influence operations where the media outlet is being imitated. It's not, the first one is not, well, let me rephrase that. The first example is from Sputnik. This is the website that Warren Buffett bought ads on. This is a claim that Zelensky used Western aid to buy Highgrove Estate from King Charles. This article included a video story about it. It included documents. It included what looked like a copy of the sales document. Very detailed. Our analyst who covers the Russian influence operation saw the article, asked herself, I wonder if this is really true. And the butler at Highgrove Estate was quoted in this story. She called the butler at Highgrove Estate. He hadn't seen the article yet, but he, of course, said, oh, that's completely bollocks. That was made up, as indeed, of course, it was. But if somebody had seen this and asked an LLM, is this really true? They would have been assured, oh, yes, that's true. The second photo that you see there, that's Jeffrey Epstein, Bill Gates, a young Mayor Mamdani with his mother, uh, and Jeff Bezos and Bill Clinton. Uh, this appeared on InfoWars, the website published by Alex Jones, who became famous by claiming that school shootings were staged. Um, this is a great example of how AI can fool people. That looks like a legit photograph. The third one is a Russian campaign again, where this is designed to look like an article from The Economist. This is not from The Economist, falsely citing Angela Merkel's comments about Europe and its economy. We found now more than 100 well-known news websites being impersonated by what's called the Matryoshka campaign in Russia. And virtually every website and news brand you've heard of has been imitated by this campaign, typically with AI. So what to do? I'm so glad to have the chance to talk to people who can influence investors. The easiest thing for CEOs and CMOs to do is to tell their ad agency, you got to stop putting my ads on these websites. You don't have to use NewsGuard. There are other solutions in the market, but it's ridiculous that years after this problem has become known, that I would say 90%, 10% of brands use a service like ours, 90% of brands do not. And this problem can be, to some large degree, solved by CEOs and CMOs using a service like ours to make their programmatic advertising brand safe. Shareholder proposals are great. I think spreading AI fakes is to some degree the responsibility of the AI models, Google and others. They should be held to account. We did not have, I would say, great success in holding the social media platforms to account for what they fed their users and continue to feed their users. The AI models, I don't think, get the protection of Section 230, which immunized the social media platforms. I think they'll be more sensitive to liability, and putting pressure on them to take more steps to make their AI models more accurate and credible would be great. And more generally, all the stakeholders, whether they're AI companies, social media platforms, advertisers, everybody as part of this environment really should be encouraged to be held to act in a responsible way, to accept that there are some responsibilities that come with their opportunities in the market. And as I said at the beginning, I have great confidence in the capital markets, but these are urgent problems, and I hope that this group can find a way to put pressure on all of the stakeholders to do the right thing.
Great. Thanks, Gordon. Real quick question on a 1 to 10 scale. How optimistic are you that we're not going to do it in this hour, but that the problem can be solved?
I'm a 0 when it comes to social media companies. I think we've missed that boat entirely. I'm around a 6 on AI models because I think it's really in their self-interest to make their models more credible and more believable. Sam Altman is still saying, rightly, don't trust our platforms on factual matters. The platforms still hallucinate, they repeat Russian false claims, but that's really not in their interest. They're trying to license their AI models to consumers for a fee or to corporations and governments. And people expect to get accurate information from the AI models, which they are not getting. So I'm more optimistic about them. I think I don't know how long it will take for them to solve this problem. They believe they have bigger problems to solve, but I think this is a pretty big problem which they have not solved.
Great. Thank you. We're going to come back to you a little bit later, I think. But now we're going to turn to Michael Khoo. You know, many of the people on this call are investors, and I believe many of them have been involved in issues regarding climate change. Michael Khoo co-founded the Climate Action Against Disinformation coalition at Friends of the Earth in 2018, and that coalition pressured Google, Facebook, TikTok, Pinterest, and Twitter to adopt climate disinformation policies. He's published research on the intersection of climate denial and QAnon. He's documented the spread of extreme weather climate information and a number of other issues. And he has helped secure the Global Initiative on Information Integrity on Climate Change, a 2025 UN agreement at COP30 in Brazil. And I will now leave it to Michael, my friend Michael from long ago. We've worked together on many things. Michael, take it away.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to Open Mic for hosting this. Thanks to NewsGuard for their excellent work and Shorenstein Center. It certainly takes a village to even understand this problem, let alone have the audacity to think we can help solve it. It is great to partner again with Open Mic. We worked on net neutrality back more than a decade ago. I'm going to share some slides here. And a second. Slideshow, ready from start. There we go. Everyone good with seeing that?
Yep.
Okay. So I guess get to the main point of this, which is to talk about the 8 different ways that I see AI making the broader information environment problems worse. I'm going to go through these in a minute, but later in the presentation. But I wanted to start by backing up before AI, as Gordon also alluded to, that we have a broader information environment problem, of which AI is a grand accelerant and an accelerant in slightly different ways that we can get into. But I want to talk about sort of the 6 principles that we've learned and fought against that are trends happening in the media environment, the information environment that are sort of underpin it all. So, and then after that, we'll talk very briefly about the big buckets of solutions, some of which he and Shorenstein would be alluding to as well. Let's start with just stepping back to think about the networks of disinformation that exist. And, whether you think about the Russian networks, or in this case on the left, we've got a graph, some research that came out of Brown University, Timmons Roberts, describing the network of anti-wind disinformation networks that are trying to stop the build out of renewables. These are what you can call coordinated inauthentic networks, where a very small group of people has a very outsized impact on the information environment. You can see how complex the web of networks works on the left, and in the middle you see the massive expansion of climate denial that happens as a result on the platforms that people see. And most recently, here's an article from Canada where the major content providers of conspiracy theories are coming from just a very small slice. And these are studies that we repeat over and over again to show that it is a small group who are having an outsized impact. And it really is the opacity of the industry, the enforced or the unregulated opacity that is allowing that. When you think of back to the old news days of circulation, Nielsen circulation numbers, that was the transparency by which you knew the Wall Street Journal had more subscribers than National Enquirer. But those were audited. Now you actually have somewhere underneath someone's desktop the exact numbers. But the industry's resistance to any transparency has prevented us to have a view of who is actually in control. So it's that algorithmic manipulation and the opacity that has been at the heart of some of these problems, by which you can have these giant spikes that seem to come out of nowhere, and then you later do the forensic work and you find out exactly where they came from, and they're very repeatable sources. This second picture at the bottom there is the black box that Gordon talks about as well. We have a couple of partners with Check My Ads, another group, and Conscious Ad Network, who do a lot of work to unpack this massive area where there's so much money that is given to nefarious actors and a giant and growing disinformation industry. The other major factor in the incentives or in the media environment is obviously the decline in trust in news and news audiences that we've all seen happen over the past decade and a half. That unfortunately happens at the same time that you get more non-fact check news outlets. And just to pause on fact checking as a concept, it is both robust, it's got a long history. And the difference between a blog, and there's lots of great blogs out there, that's not trashing all blogs and podcasts, but is that most of them don't pay for the very onerous process of fact checking. And what they do is sort of parasitic content where they are taking things that are fact checked and they're monetizing it. That is happening both on the podcast level and on the advertising level. And we see it sort of as a straight transfer of wealth from journalists' pockets into ultimately Google and Facebook as the two major ad monopolies into their pockets. And so that's on the news side. And then on the social media side, you see these massive layoffs in trust and safety that the big companies are doing just as they're increasing their profits rapidly. And so what you have is really a lack of accountability in the past when you had things like the housing crisis or there's Bernie Ebbers being carted off. But now you have people like Mark Zuckerberg who go and testify and lie and are caught in a lie in front of Congress, and there are no costs because these billionaire tech owners and media owners are very close to both Congress and the White House, where they are weaponizing the government. And you have the accountability to further it, where you look at how we've treated January 6th in our country. And you have a great example in Brazil that I'll bring up in a few ways, where they have taken quite the opposite approach to the accountability of the attempted overthrow of the government. And Brazil remains actually one of the bright lights for building up a stronger media ecosystem. It was at the heart of our agreement at COP in November, the Global Information Integrity on Climate Change Agreement. Two other things, I guess, what we're having in the media environment is that Congress, the White House, Department of Justice, USTR, and even the international institutions being threatened to weaponize against the regulation of disinformation or the regulation of AI and of the media environment more broadly. So there's very just active pressure by all forces in all levers of government there. And then you have lawsuits. Some of our partners are in the middle of lawsuits by Elon Musk that are threatening to bankrupt nonprofits. That would be their goal. So I'll move on to just talking about the current subject of AI. And just to remember how this all started even at the beginning of ChatGPT, where Sam Altman, asked Scarlett Johansson if he could use her voice, and she said no, and he went ahead and used it anyway. He says it wasn't her, but there was obviously everybody else, including her, thought it was. And then, of course, the deep fake images that you have of Trump using Taylor Swift. And I think, it's a conversation for another time, but the use of sexualized content in AI systems is actually increasingly a part of what's driving the profit. And certainly OpenAI being more open to that is going to be another factor in degrading the news environment. So I'll go briefly through these examples of 8 different ways that AI is making all those problems I just described much worse. AI as your new grassroots advocate. You have multiple stories from Los Angeles to Canada of AI chatbots flooding local communities, local city councils with disinformation and fake AstroTurf campaigns. So we've all seen AstroTurf over the last 50 years. This is just simply making it much easier and much more opaque to detect. You can see AI as a harassment tool. A great new story about a coder who was getting AI-generated code into his stream and disallowed it, as coders in the open source world do. And that AI bot wrote a hit piece about the person in order to attack them. So we've all seen harassment of climate scientists, that's for sure, in our area. This is just yet one more tool that you can have a bunch of bots who are doing false content and then creating harassment campaigns for the people who push back. You have AI as low-cost disinformers and designers, and Gordon spoke to a lot to that, and the images that come along, especially with number 5, extreme weather disinformation, has become a real focus for us, both from Hurricane Helene that saw foreign influence to Canada's wildfires that have MAGA disinformers filling up their coffers as they spread disinformation. Gordon talked a lot about the new search and how AI snippets that they put at the top are both opaque and subject to manipulation. I think the chatbot's greenwashing is part of it, and that was one study that Global Witness, a partner of ours, found. So when you ask for the answers about the more marginal cases of climate solutions, they're certainly touting a lot of the fossil fuel industry's lines. And number 7, AI ads as a revenue for organized crime. One citation we rely on is that the World Federation of Advertisers says that ad fraud is the second largest source of income for organized crime, right after drugs. Just showing you the extent of the problem. And then last, AI is a news revenue parasite. And again, this transference of wealth from journalists, who were never the most highly paid people in society to begin with, into the coffers of the ad monopolies. These are at least 8 of the obvious threats that are just adding fuel to the fire. Last few things I'll say is we did a report just a couple of weeks ago about the AI climate hoax and how AI companies are saying they're going to save the planet. Meanwhile, the data centers they are expanding are actually burning it down. And so we fact-checked all of their claims and found that 74% of their claims that they're saving the planet are either totally false or just made up, uncited. So we're trying to push back against just that narrative that they do as well. The solutions, I want to say that, this is actually not a hard problem to solve. And I think the great ruse of working in the tech space is that everyone says tech regulation is complex, content moderation is complex. These things aren't complex. Colonizing Mars is complex. Connecting 2 billion people and their children and their grandparents, that's actually complex. This is pretty straightforward. And we have a long history of doing it around new technologies. And I'll refer to the 1950s when we had a new technology that wanted to commercialize, and they made their entire sales pitch only about safety and created a transparent system to report the worst horrors of their safety violations. This system is available for us today, and between the opacity and the accountability that you get from that, we can do that at every level. And I'll say that you can see some of this happening in the European Union, most recently levying a fine against Elon Musk for the manipulation of the blue check system, which is so obviously being done to promote neo-Nazis and to let them monetize themselves while squashing more balanced information. And you can see across the world, there are regulations from Spain to Japan to New Zealand to Canada they're popping up. Regulation still works. We need to not give up on that. Yes, we can have corporate policies, and we had this moment of being successful at getting all these companies to give us policies, which they promptly overturned whenever it was financially and politically convenient for them to do so. So we need to stop letting very few people pull the strings on our information environment. Thanks a lot for letting me speak.
Terrific. Thank you, Michael. I'm conscious of time. We're running a little late, and I want to give Shuwei time because I think Shuwei is going to have a somewhat different perspective on some of this. She comes at it from a different angle. Shuwei Fang is a fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. Her work maps the paradigm shifts that AI causes in information ecosystems. And I'm going to let her tell you about that. Previously, Shuwei was Associate Director of Programs at Open Society Foundations, where she led programs ensuring the free flow of information to audiences through media, emerging technology, and arts and culture. She holds advanced degrees in economics from the London School of Economics, and is co-author of a Substack called Radically Informed. Shuwei, tell us.
Appreciate the shout out for the Substack. Okay, so I'm going to come at this from a slightly different angle, and I'm not a misinformation specialist by any means. What I actually work on is how AI is structurally reshaping the information ecosystems, the economics, the flows, and the incentives. And I think that lens is actually relevant here because if the underlying model is changing, then the way we need to think about misinformation probably needs to change with it. So what I'll do is, with the 10 minutes that I have, is very quickly lay out some of the structural shifts. Then I want to pivot and make a bull case for knowledge. And what I mean by knowledge is any sort of information system that is inherently truth-seeking and self-correcting. And that includes journalism, education, science publishing, and all of those things that we know to be sort of more structurally sound than the fluency of misinformation that we've just heard about. So I want to also just suggest here, and I might not have time to go into this, that the opportunity and the threat caused by this paradigm shift might actually be two sides of the same coin. So let me share my screen and hopefully get right into this. Here we go. Can you see that?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Cool. Okay, so much of the conversation around AI in the information sector, at least, or how I've experienced it, is really about efficiency. So, how do we use AI within existing workflows to produce existing products faster, cheaper, quicker? I think the same goes around sort of how adversarial networks and misinformation happens in this space for good reason. But what I'm really interested in is what happens beyond that. And I think of this, I think it's quite useful to think of the coming changes in three phases. So the efficiency phase, which is what I just described, AI applied to existing tasks within existing workflows to produce existing information products in the existing competitive environment. But then what I see is unfolding at the moment is really essentially a new AI mediated information ecosystem where the fundamental structures, the incentives, physics and economics are radically different. And then overlapping these two phases is a transition phase, which I think we're currently in, where the system is changing to such an extent that the existing models are starting to break, and we see evidence of that. So in this transition phase, I'm seeing four cascading paradigm shifts that are starting to play out. And they're not happening in isolation. Each one almost creates the conditions for the next. So we go from scarcity of information to abundance of information. We go from a human audience to one that is primarily machine. We go from information artifacts, content, to liquid content, which is a different flow model compared to one that's around stocks. And then finally, the shift from an attention economy to an intention economy. And now this one is pretty early, but I think if it happens and rolls out fast, I think could change everything. So let me take each one quickly. I have early evidence and early signals for all, but in the interest of time, I just want to keep this quite quick. So first shift, scarcity to abundance. You just heard the other speakers talk about this. I won't go into more detail. Essentially, information gathering used to be hard. Now it's really easy. The cost of producing competent information that looks okay, it has basically collapsed. Really familiar to almost everyone here. But the thing to remember here is that not everything is now abundant. Human attention is still pretty scarce. It's actually scarcer than ever, given the relative volume of information. And ground truth, actually going out and verifying something in the real world, that's still expensive. So what's next? We go from human consumption to agentic consumption, and abundance almost creates creates the necessary conditions from this. Humans need to navigate the information environment, and we're not able to do it alone. And so machines have become necessary intermediaries. These are quite jargonistic terms in the information sector, and so I'll explain. So we've gone from a B to C model, which is essentially publishers serving their readers directly, so newspapers direct to an audience, to a model which is now B to B to C, which is essentially around platforms distributing content. And I think now we're moving to a system which is B to A to C, which is essentially AI sitting in the middle between producers of information and the audience. Or more realistically, it's probably going to be something like B to A 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 to C, and so on. So chains of agents basically consuming and recomposing information on behalf of agents before it ever reaches a human. One careful distinction to make here is that this is fundamentally different to the platform era of ranking and recommendation systems. So in the current and previous era of platform recommendations, what platforms did essentially was take a piece of content or pieces of content and reorder and rank them for the user at a personalized level. What machines as intermediaries does is essentially completely changes all this. It doesn't take those complete URLs and links anymore. It extracts the semantic value of them, disassembles it, and recomposes it for the human in the moment. And I'll sort of tell you a little bit more about what that looks like now. And this is the shift from immutable information artifacts to experiences of liquid information. This is basically the experience that any one of us gets when we talk to an AI interface, so ChatGPT or Claude or anything. So information here essentially stops being a thing and becomes a flow. And we go from information in buckets and containers to information flowing through pipes, from a stock model of artifacts to a flow model of information. And this might be confused with something that we all sort of talk about, AI reversioning content. So an essay becomes a podcast or a video or something like that. Liquid content is quite different to this. This isn't just another like reversioning. So really, it's about extracting the semantic value of information within a contained article away from the syntax, the container, or the wrapper. And so what the AI has here is a form of functional editorial and commissioning agency. It decides what to extract, the one sentence from the 2,000-word essay, if at all, or even just the meaning, and combines it with several other sources at the, right in the moment when it furs a need from the user. So really, it's nothing. It's not like Google ranking content or Facebook distributing it. It's AI intermediaries extracting meaning, interpreting, and recomposing at the individual interface. And this isn't really about distribution. It's fundamentally something new. And then finally, the fourth shift from attention to intention. And the entire information economy, as we've known it, has been built around attention. So what can I get you to look at? How many clicks? How many minutes on a page? But these signals were always proxies for what we actually, or what advertisers actually wanted to know. What do people need? What do they want to accomplish? And now, for the first time, AI systems can not just understand what someone asked, but why they asked it, what their situation is, and what could actually help them. And what is emerging around this is an economy built on intention, not attention. This is what intent plus context means in an AI setting. And I think it's these intention signals that will be the driving force in the next information ecosystem and could be one of the most strategically important emerging assets here. I think this will, it will essentially change everything about where value, incentives, and everything else in the ecosystem lies. So what happens now in this transition period? Well, it's not great news in the immediate term, especially for groups that are information providers. And so in this transition period, we're already starting to see some of this shaking out. And really, it's a short-term threat to a legacy business model for knowledge producers. But I think ultimately, and we'll get there is a reason for long-term optimism. So what happens with the shift from scarcity to abundance? We know this already. Production stops being a moat. With human to machine audiences, there's disintermediation, and a journalism publisher's audience becomes someone else's customer. And when artifacts become liquid and go from a stock to a flow model, the middle of the market flows out. And when attention shifts to intention, information providers essentially lose the entire demand signal, which was the basis for the entire pricing economy of information. So let me go through the last two in a little bit more detail because they are slightly complicated. This is what happens when information becomes liquid. You get this barbell effect, which I think for some of the investors in the room might be familiar with in other contexts in retail and airlines. Essentially, you get, when the same information can reshape itself across any format, the economic value of that individual piece of content approaches zero. So you get this classic barbell, which is pure commodity at one end, low cost, near zero margins, so things like Bloomberg and Reuters and Perplexity and essentially AI interfaces, acting more like infrastructure than publishers. And on the other end, you get some sort of high pure premium products, so high margins, smaller audiences, competing on brand and differentiation. So think the sort of the creator models this is happening. And the middle, where I think most news publishers and knowledge providers sit today, will hollow out. The current unit economics will not be supported by this shift. And then let's look at the economics of the attention to intention shift in practice. Consider when someone asks Claude, should I wait to buy a house? Underneath, the system is considering their timeline, noting that their partner disagrees, assessing risk tolerance. It identifies that the real need here is partly emotional, partly informational. So what they really need is a reassurance and a framework for a conversation, not an article about mortgage rates. So in the attention economy, this person's exact needs could never have been structurally addressed. There was no reason for their specific situation, no article that could have met that precisely, and no product that was shaped to receive it. But the demand was real. It was just never addressable. With intention signals and liquid content, it now is. So all of this to say, in the near term, this transition period, this is going to be really, really hard for information producers. The demand signal goes dark, the query goes to Claude, not to publishers. And the commoditization effect I just described, the barbell, might be survivable if they have demand and intention signals, but at the moment, there are no metrics or attribution protocols to support that. So information producers might be able to survive commoditization if they can see and serve demand, but not if they're flying blind. So all of that probably sounds like a funeral, and horrifying for most producers of information. And to be honest, in some ways it is. It really is, I think, a funeral for an information business model, which includes misinformation built on notions of scarcity, platform ranking and recommendations, static artifacts, and an attention-based economy. But here's where I want to pivot, and I want to make a different argument. I think that the market for knowledge that we're about to get in this new ecosystem could be much, much bigger. So firstly, what happens, I think that value is not destroyed entirely. It will migrate to new functions. All of the value that used to be bundled inside information artifacts or content containers, so verification, content, trust, provenance, those don't disappear when the artifact dissolves. They become separable and probably productized in and of itself. I think NewsGuard is a really early example of this happening and could be scaled up for this next CSIP system, essentially verification as infrastructure. So on the right, I won't go through all of these, but I encourage you to look these up. Essentially, what this might look like, it's processed as product, and there are some examples of what this might look like. Essentially, taking all the best processes of journalism and verification and packaging them as products, editorial algorithms, infrastructural fact checking, that sort of thing. So, and then what else happens? There's an expansion of supply. So along with value migration, we get value creation on the supply side. So we know that the production cost collapse means that knowledge that was too expensive to produce becomes now viable. We also know that dead weight loss reduction means the information that already exists but isn't usable gets unlocked. So all of these fill reliable information vacuums, and I think it's information vacuums that is usually where misinformation thrives. And then looking at the demand side expansion, there are three overlapping mechanisms that I see happening here. So firstly, relevance. Existing information and useful truth-seeking knowledge reaches the person who needs it in a form they can use. So a 200-page report becomes the sentence that actually matters to you. And then agentic consumption assumes consuming on your behalf, that not only increases the usefulness and density of the information that you actually need, it's also an entirely new demand category. And then, of course, the latent demand surfaced. Going back to the Claude example that I walked you through earlier, can you imagine trying to Google, should I wait to buy a house if my wife disagrees and I'm risk averse and we might relocate in 2 years, and frankly, I'm not sure about her anyway, and I really may need someone to tell me it's just going to be okay. That search didn't exist before, but I think the demand did, and now it's addressable. And finally, this is quite a bold claim, but over every major information disruption throughout the last 1,000 years, writing, printing, radio, the internet, mobile, eventually expanded the total addressable market for information. I think AI's distinctive contribution here isn't just access, it's comprehension. So while previous revolutions made information available to more people, AI will remove that cognitive barrier. Millions of people who can technically reach a public health study today, but very few can meaningfully engage with it. AI intermediaries can bridge that gap if we build carefully. So I think the addressable market for trustworthy information and information that is inherently truth-seeking and self-correcting is not contracting. I think it is possibly larger than it has ever been. So let me bring this back to more sort of practicalities. While I have high conviction that AI could radically expand value in this new ecosystem, I am less convinced about where that value accrues. I don't think it's going to be evenly distributed by default. There are some conditions here which I will not go into because we don't have time, but essentially, where stakeholders need competition at the point of consumption, where we need demand signal visibility, and where society essentially needs shared epistemics and these hyper-personalized bubbles of one in the future. And this is where I'll stop because I've massively run out of time. I think, just to bring it back to the what can investors do, to create these conditions to address this new market really requires a build mindset. I've spent a really long time studying this. I've just come out of a session, basically, talking about the new investment categories, pipeline prospects, and everything else. I'm happy to talk about this offline, and I'll leave my email address with the organizers for you to share if you want to talk about it. But essentially, I think the mindset that accompanies this is maybe to not just think about, optimizing for the current ecosystem, but thinking beyond about what we can build natively as these new dynamics are playing out. Thank you, and sorry for talking too much.
You didn't talk too much at all. Thank you, Shuwei. And we are right at time, and I know our panelists have other commitments and lot to think about. Moderator's privilege. I would be remiss if I didn't mention a shareholder proposal that's on the ballot. We think on the ballot at Alphabet for you who are investors, having to do with AI and misinformation, asking Alphabet to assess the risks of AI and misinformation. So please be out on the lookout for that. So we are at time. I want to thank our guests. I think Gordon had to leave. He had a hard out at noon. Michael Khoo, Shuwei Fang, Audrey, thank you all. And thanks, everybody. Thank you for a great session. I'm glad we have solved this problem in the course of 1 hour. It's terrific. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thanks for having us.